Bubble is a really great tool, but sometimes you will not want to use Bubble's database or backend in your web app. And if you do, it can really damage your app's performance now and your ability to scale in the future. So in this video, I'm going to go through 5 good reasons why you shouldn't use Bubble's backend. Now, this isn't to say that you should never use it, but if one or more of these things I'm going to talk about applies to your project, then you might want to think about it again. By the way, my name is Matt. I've been a developer since 2017, and I've developed loads of projects in Bubble, some being my own, some being for clients. So these things I'm going to go through today are from my own experiences and my own pains. So let's get into it. So reason number 1, you might not want to use Bubble's backend is if you have lots of data. I was recently working on a project that deals with energy data, where we had a list of machines, lots and lots of machines, and each machine has an energy reading every 15 minutes for the last 5 years. So this was a huge amount of data, millions of records, and just tens of millions of data points. Instead of using Bubble, we used BigQuery. The reason for this is that Bubble isn't meant to handle that much data. Thousands of records, yep, not a problem. Tens of thousands of records, yep, that's fine. But when you start to get to 100,000 records, hundreds of thousands of records, and maybe millions of data points, now you're reaching the edge of what's a good idea to use Bubble for. If you did use Bubble's database for this, you'd find that it'd be very slow when you wanted to do anything with data, which is all that software pretty much does. It'd be very slow to add new records. It'd be slow to make changes to the data. One of the biggest things that it would take a long time for, and that we use a lot of work units, is a search of the database in Bubble. So perhaps for a repeating group or for a calculation. So if you have a large amount of data, or you think you will in the near future, then you might want to use a platform to host your backend on that isn't Bubble. Number 2 reason for not wanting to use Bubble's database is if you make a lot of changes to the data. The main reason for this is that every time you make a change to a thing in Bubble and Bubble's database, it costs work units. I've worked on a project before where we needed to have an audit trail of every action that a user takes, as it was to do with something in real estate, and if they ever went to court for something, they needed to be able to track it back to who did what and when they did it, and have that logged. And this meant that basically every button that a user clicked, we had to track it and log it, which meant a lot of changes to rows in the database. And for this reason, it was just really unfeasible to have the backend on Bubble. So for that project, we used Xano as the backend. So even if you don't have a lot of data in your database, but you're constantly changing it, every second, and you have lots of users, then you might want to think about using a separate backend in that case. Now, the next reason is if your data needs to be compliant. If your project relates to maybe medical records or to finances or other types of sensitive data, then you may need to hold this data in a database that is compliant with the relevant protocol to whatever the data is that you're holding. Most projects don't need this. If you do, you'll probably know that you need this. But when you do need compliance, you will have to hold the data in another database and probably perform the calculations within that database, within that backend as well. Now, depending on the type of data and the type of compliance that you need, you may not even be able to use Bubble's front end for it. This is pretty rare, but it does happen. But just be aware that if you have sensitive data, the Bubble database might not hack it. Next is speed. Believe it or not, Bubble's database is not the fastest database to use when you want to pull data from the back end to the front end. It does seem kind of odd to say, as you think that if it was all on Bubble, it would be nice and quick, but it's not always like that. At the moment, Xano is my preferred backend for most complex projects, and virtually every time it will be quicker to pull data that I need from Xano's backend into Bubble than it will be to pull it from Bubble's backend into Bubble's front end. If you're performing any sort of calculation on that data as well, such as you want to sum the cost of a list of things, and you just want to show that total, then Xano or other backends will likely be faster than doing this just in Bubble. Now, unless you have loads of data, it won't make a massive difference, usually less than a second, but it does, really help to create a nice experience if everything runs quickly, and most importantly is for future proofing. If it's being slow when you've only got 1,000 records in your database, when you get to 10,000 to 100,000, it's going to be much, much slower, and you're going to really have a degraded user experience there. So if you really want your app to be really quick, then you might want to use a separate backend. And lastly, if you know that you're going to migrate away from Bubble at some point, then I really don't think it's worth using Bubble's backend even from the start. Now, Bubble has vendor lock-in, meaning that you can't export your code. So many people plan to move away from Bubble when they get to a certain size, so they can own the IPs, they can host it on their own servers, and loads of other reasons. This is much, much easier to do when your backend is not on Bubble and when you just have to rebuild the front end of the application. So if you're certain that Bubble will only be the starting step for you, so you can make it to market sooner, then I would say put your backend elsewhere. I'll also say that If you have plans to do something cross-platform, which usually means build native iOS apps or Android apps, then you might want to have a separate backend as well, as it makes it much easier to create a system that all has one common backend rather than having to duplicate data and to sync data across different databases, which is just all becomes a mess. So those are 5 reasons why you would not want to use Bubble's backend. Let's run through them again. If you have loads and loads of data, probably not a good idea. If you want to make lots of changes very swiftly to your data, then probably not a good idea. If it needs to be compliant, then you just pretty much can't use it. If you want it to be really, really speedy, then the Bubble database is not the one to go for. And if you know you're going to migrate away at some point in the future, or if you're going to build cross-platform, then that's another reason why you would not want to use Bubble's backend. Now, Bubble is really great because it allows you to move fast, but if you don't get the backend right to begin with, it's really going to give yourself a headache, potentially a very costly headache, later down the road. So hopefully that's made it clear to you whether you should be using Bubble's backend or whether you should be using another backend. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me or leave a comment on this video. That is it. I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.